Good evening. I'm Paul Carice. I'm the director of this new academic unit at Arizona State University, the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership. And it is my honor to welcome you to this lecture and discussion on why free speech is fundamental with Professor Steven Pinker of Harvard University. This is the 9th event in this year-long series of lectures with the title Free Speech and Intellectual Diversity in Higher Education and American Society. 9 is counting as one event our 3-day annual conference on the theme of the series in February. That conference itself featured 28 speakers in all. What a great year of conversations and debates and dialogues we have had, and we are pretty sure that our final speaker in the lineup will not disappoint. The school is very happy to be co-sponsoring the entire series with 2 Arizona State University partners, the Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication and the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law. And we are delighted that tonight, as with so many of our other events, we have a great turnout, so many people interested in these important issues. We also have with us this evening distinguished leaders from Arizona State University, from Arizona government, and from the Phoenix community. Well over 3,000 people from Arizona State University and the broader Phoenix community have attended the lecture and dialogue events this year. The School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership has convened experts on free speech and intellectual diversity and a broader array of civic and intellectual leaders in American life to explore the heated debates and clashes on American campuses about freedom of speech, civility, diversity, and inclusion. Episodes of violence or of disinviting speakers, and the widespread concern about a narrowed range of discourse on many campuses are vitally important issues for educators, of course, but also for our broader civic fabric. These university episodes reflect and reinforce the angry polarization and discord that has grown in American life in recent years. So our school is collecting all of the presentations in this year's series, the individual lectures, the dialogue events, the conference in February, all of it into a published volume. And we are also very happy to be collaborating, as you can see, with Arizona PBS, which is recording all of the events in the series. They are making their own special series entitled Free Speech Challenge of Our Times out of each of these episodes. They are already up and archived on the Arizona PBS website. You can find them there. You can also find the video of all of our events in full, and also a link to the PBS website on the school's website, skettle.asu.edu. So just a brief word about the mission of this new school, because it's new, then I'll introduce a distinguished speaker. The School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership is dedicated to reviving the crucial link between civic education and classical liberal education in America's universities and colleges. We think this is the best way to prepare thoughtful leaders for both civil society and for public service. We have a major and a minor just approved by the university. We feature courses on great works and great debates of civic, economic, political, and moral thought. We supplement that with broader experiences about leadership and statesmanship, including internships, experiential leadership and service trips. Our first one was to India. And also public events like this, all as a foundation for both understanding and practicing leadership in 21st century America and our globalized world. We also think that a return to some fundamental ideas and debates might provide a calmer and broader perspective in our polarized and divided times. As I mentioned, surely one of the most fundamental recurring debates of American law and life is the meaning of freedom of speech, both as a legal principle and for its broader role in educational settings and American politics. Speakers and audience members in our events this year have noted that the school and our partners have succeeded in taking a controversial set of issues like this and having a lively but civil debate encompassing a range of intellectual and political views. Next year, we are seeking the same spirit in the theme we've chosen for the 2018-2019 series, which is polarization and civility in both higher education and American society. But I'm getting ahead of myself talking about next year. First to this evening's discussion. We are delighted to conclude this year's series with a distinguished scholar and professor turned public intellectual, Dr. Steven Pinker. I won't do justice to his career. I'll just briefly mention that he is currently the John Stone Professor of Psychology at Harvard University, author of many books and articles in his fields of evolutionary psychology and language. These are very extensively cited by other scholars. Those books in his fields include How the Mind Works and The Blank Slate. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, a two-time Pulitzer Prize finalist, a Humanist of the Year, and he's been listed by Foreign Policy magazine as one of the world's top 100 public intellectuals, and by Time magazine as one of their 100 most influential people in the world today. And his two most recent books provide important context for his remarks this evening. From 2011, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined, and most recently, Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress. So we have three parts for the evening. Professor Pinker will offer his prepared remarks. Then in part two of the evening, you can see from the chairs, we'll have a brief interview. I'll pose some questions. And then in part three, we have some microphones in the audience for questions from the audience. So please join me in welcoming Professor Steven Pinker on why free speech is fundamental. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. A few years ago, I wrote a chapter on swearing and taboo language, which began, quote, "It's no coincidence that freedom of speech is enshrined in the first of the 10 amendments to the Constitution that make up the Bill of Rights, because freedom of speech is the foundation of democracy." It didn't take long for a historian to write to me saying, actually, it is a coincidence. Originally, the framers had framed 12 amendments, of which the one guaranteeing free speech was third. The first two, which deal with how congressmen were paid and other housekeeping issues, failed to pass, resulting in the third amendment being promoted to first. Well, it serves me right for assuming that history provides us with neat symbolism that makes for cute chapter openings. Still, I could have written, "It's fitting that the constitutional guarantee of free speech is the first of the 10 amendments, because free speech is indeed the foundation of democracy, and, as I hope to remind you this evening, of much else that is worthwhile in life." More than 2 centuries after freedom of speech was enshrined in the First Amendment, that right is very much in the news. Campus speech codes, disinvited commencement speakers, deplatformed professors, jailed performance artists, exiled leakers, a blogger condemned to 1,000 lashes by one of our closest allies, and the massacre of a dozen French cartoonists have forced the democratic world to examine the roots of its commitment to free speech. Is free speech merely a symbolic talisman, like a national flag or motto? Is it just one of many values that we trade off against each other? Was Pope Francis right when he said that, quote, "You cannot make fun of the faith of others"? May universities muzzle some students to protect the sensibilities of others? Did the Charlie Hebdo cartoonists, quote, "cross a line that separates free speech from toxic talk," as the dean of a school of journalism opined at the time? Or is free speech fundamental, a right which, if not absolute, should be abrogated only in carefully circumscribed cases? The answer I will argue this evening is that free speech is indeed fundamental, and it's important to remind ourselves why, and to have the reasons at our fingertips when that right is called into question. There's a danger that freedom of speech will become a term of boilerplate, a box to be ticked, an element in a long list of things that people value without being able to explain why. That could even feed a more pernicious development, free speech becoming an identity badge of the political right. In my book, Enlightenment Now, I reviewed the literature on human rationality and discovered that the principal cause of stupidity in the political realm is not, as many scientists suspect, scientific or historical illiteracy, but politicization. As soon as an issue becomes branded as a sacred cause of the political left or the political right, intelligent people shut down their critical faculties. They accept arguments and evidence or blow them off, depending only on which tribe they appear to vindicate, They even lose their ability to do arithmetic. If through intellectual laziness we allow free speech to become associated in people's minds with the political right, just because some of the notorious challenges involve left-wing groups suppressing non-left-wing speakers, then it's game over for free speech on college campuses and much of the mainstream media. Free speech advocates thus should take care not to attack only left-wing intolerance and not to invite only right-wing controversial speakers. That's why when I was asked to provide advice to the Harvard Open Campus Initiative, an admirable new undergraduate organization dedicated to open debate, I urged them to invite people like Noam Chomsky so that controversial speakers would not be conflated with the political right. And I have to say, in this regard, I was alarmed to receive a fundraising letter from a lobbying organization for unregulated corporate campaign contributions, a la Citizens United, which used to go by the Orwellian name Center for Competitive Politics, and recently has adopted the even more Orwellian name Center for Free Speech. So what are the reasons that we should elevate free speech as a cardinal right in politics and academia? I'll suggest 4. The first thing is that the very thing that we're doing when we ask whether free speech is fundamental, namely exchanging and evaluating ideas, presupposes that we have the right to exchange and evaluate ideas. In talking about free speech, or anything else, we're talking. We're not settling our disagreement by a beauty contest, or an auction, or a pistol duel. Unless you're willing to discredit yourself by declaring, in the words of the great free speech advocate Nat Hentoff, free speech for me but not for thee, then as soon as you show up to a debate to argue against free speech, you've lost it. Second, free speech is the only way to acquire knowledge about the world. Perhaps the greatest discovery in human history, one that is logically prior to every other discovery, is that all of our traditional sources of belief are generators of delusion and should be dismissed as sources of knowledge. These include faith, revelation, dogma, authority, charisma, augury, prophecy, intuition, clairvoyance, conventional wisdom, and the warm glow of subjective certainty. How then can we know? None of us is omniscient, none of us is infallible. Other than by proving mathematical and logical theorems, which are not about the material world, the answer is the process that Karl Popper called conjecture and refutation. We come up with ideas about the nature of reality, and we test them against that reality, allowing the world to falsify the mistaken ones. The conjecture part of this formula, of course, presupposes the exercise of free speech. We offer conjectures without any prior assurance that they're correct. It is only by bruiting ideas and seeing which ones withstand attempts to refute them that we acquire knowledge. Once this realization sank in during the scientific revolution, the age of reason, and the Enlightenment, the traditional understanding of the world was decimated. Everyone knows that the discovery that the Earth revolves around the sun had to overcome fierce resistance from common sense and ecclesiastical authority. But the Copernican revolution was just the first event in a cataclysm that would make our current understanding of the world unrecognizable to our ancestors. We now know that the belief systems of all the world's traditional religions and cultures, their theories of the origins of life, human and societies, are factually mistaken. We know, but our ancestors did not, that humans belong to a single species of African primate that developed agriculture, government, and writing late in its history. We know that our species is a tiny twig of a genealogical tree that embraces all living things and that emerged from prebiotic chemicals almost 4 billion years ago. We know that we live on a planet that revolves around one of 100 billion stars in our galaxy, which is one of 100 billion galaxies in a 13.8 billion-year-old universe, possibly one of a vast number of universes. We know that our intuitions about space, time, matter, and causation are incommensurable with the nature of reality on scales that are very large and very small. We know that the laws governing the physical world, including accidents, disease, and other misfortunes have no goals that pertain to human well-being. There is no such thing as fate, providence, karma, spells, curses, augury, divine retribution, or answered prayers, though the discrepancy between the laws of probability and the workings of human cognition may explain why people believe there are. And we know that we did not always know these things, that the beloved convictions of every time and culture may be decisively falsified, doubtless including some we hold today. Free speech was not just central to the development of knowledge in the history of humanity, it may be central to the development of knowledge in any intelligent species, indeed any artificially intelligent system. In his brilliant book, The Beginning of Infinity, the physicist David Deutsch argues that conjecture and refutation is the only way, in principle, that knowledge can be acquired. If he is right, we can rule out that staple of science fiction, the advanced race of extraterrestrials with a higher form of intelligence. We can also stop losing sleep, Elon Musk and Stephen Hawking notwithstanding, about being displaced by an artificial general intelligence that uses its intelligence to recursively improve its intelligence, figuring out the operation of the universe, including us, and leaving us powerless to stop it. Deutsch argues that there is only one form of intelligence about the world, and modern humans have it, a combination of the ability to conjecture hypotheses, which is part of our evolved cognitive makeup, and the willingness to let the world refute them, which is an accomplishment of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. If so, the freedom to advance ideas is not just a parochial idea of Homo sapiens on planet Earth, it is an ideal of all intelligent beings. A third reason that free speech is foundational to human flourishing is that it is essential to democracy and a bulwark against tyranny. The most pressing historical question of the 20th century is how monstrous totalitarian regimes, particularly those of Stalin, Hitler, Mao, and Imperial Japan, came into existence. There are a number of conjectures, such as the popular libertarian hypothesis that societies with extensive social welfare systems and copious government regulation are likely to slide down a slippery slope into totalitarianism. It's an interesting hypothesis with a major flaw, namely that nothing of that sort has ever happened. Instead, fascist and communist regimes come to power through violent intimidation. In every case, groups of armed fanatics used violence to silence or intimidate their critics and adversaries. Even the apparently democratic election of the Nazis in 1933 was preceded by years of intimidation, murder, and violent mayhem against dissenters. And once in power, totalitarians criminalize any criticism of the regime. There's a systematic reason why dictators brook no dissent. One could imagine a regime that is armed to the teeth, can resist any insurrection, and allows its subjects to impotently bitch and moan all they want. But that's not how totalitarian societies work, and for a good reason. The immiserated subjects of a tyrannical regime are not, of course, deluded that they are happy. And if tens of millions of disaffected citizens act together, no regime has the brute force to resist them. The reason that citizens don't resist their overlords en masse is that they lack what logicians call common knowledge in the technical sense, namely the knowledge that everyone else shares their knowledge. Excuse me, I just advanced a bit too many screens. There we go. Common knowledge is a prerequisite to coordinating behavior for mutual benefit. Two friends will show up at the same cafe at a given time only if each knows that the other knows that both know about the appointment. In the case of civil resistance, people will expose themselves to the risk of reprisal from a despotic regime only if they know that others are exposing themselves to that risk at the same time. In computer simulations of artificial societies, the sociologist Michael Macy has shown that open channels of communication are essential in preventing unpopular beliefs, those that no one believes but that no one dare deny, from becoming entrenched. If true believers can punish skeptics, then a minority view can take over. But if skeptics can sample the beliefs of their compatriots, the collective delusions can unravel. common knowledge is created by public information, such as a broadcasted statement. The story of the emperor's new clothes illustrates the logic. When the little boy shouted that the emperor was naked, he wasn't telling anyone anything that they didn't already know, anything they couldn't see with their own eyeballs. But he was changing the state of their knowledge nonetheless, because now everyone knew that everyone else knew that everyone else knew that everyone else knew the emperor was naked. And that common knowledge emboldened them to challenge the emperor's authority with their laughter. The story reminds us why humor is no laughing matter, why satire and ridicule, even when puerile and tasteless, are terrifying to autocrats and protected by democracies. Satire can stealthily challenge assumptions that are second nature to an audience by forcing them to see that those assumptions lead to consequences that everyone recognizes are absurd. That's why humor so often serves as an accelerant to social progress. 18th century wise guys like Voltaire, Swift, and Samuel Johnson ridiculed the wars, oppressions, and cruel practices of their day. In the 1960s, comedians and artists portrayed racists as thick-witted Neanderthals, and Vietnam hawks and nuclear Cold Warriors as amoral psychopaths. The Soviet Union and its satellites also had a rich underground current of satire, as in the common definition of the two Cold War ideologies, quote, capitalism is the exploitation of man by man, communism is the exact opposite. We use barbed speech to undermine not just political dictators, but the petty oppressors of everyday life. The tyrannical boss, the sanctimonious preacher, the blowhard at the bar, the neighborhood enforcer of stifling norms. Now, it may seem outlandish to link American campus freedom, which by historical and global standards is still admirably high, to the world's brutal regimes. But the connection is not totally far-fetched. Last year, I addressed the Oslo Freedom Forum, a kind of TED for political dissidents. I met people who escaped from North Korea by walking across the Gobi Desert in winter, people who were jailed for a single tweet, people whose families were thrown in prison because of their own political activity. These stories put the relatively minor restrictions on campus speech in perspective. But the American commitment to unfettered speech, unrivaled even by our democratic allies in Europe, stands as a beacon of inspiration to the world's dissidents, one of the few features of the American brand that still commands global admiration. Several speakers at the forum singled out speech codes and other restrictions on expression in the United States as a worrisome development. The final reason that free speech is fundamental to civilized societies, and one that is most relevant to this particular venue in this speaker series, is that it's inseparable from the mission of higher education. Today's universities, as we have heard, are racked with debates on curricula, admissions, funding, pedagogy, sexuality, and much else, and all of them ultimately hinge on an understanding of what universities are for. As the song says, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. But I've been astonished at how professors, deans, and university presidents often can't come up with a coherent statement of what the mission of a university is. When called upon to do so, they go all misty, babbling in incoherent platitudes. A good example is the biggest bestseller on higher education of the decade, a book called Excellent Sheep by William Deresiewicz. In this scathing critique of elite universities, Deresiewicz ventures that the goal of a university education is for students to build a self, which he explicates as follows. It is only through the act of establishing communication between the mind and the heart, the mind and experience, that you become an individual, a unique being, a soul. I've heard similar mission statements from my own colleagues during our never-ending process of defining the curriculum for general education. This vision, to the extent that one can make sense of it, is, at least to me, rather troubling. Though I've been a professor for more than 3 decades, I have no idea how to get students to acquire a self or build a soul. It isn't taught in graduate school, and we've never evaluated a candidate for hiring or promotion by how well he or she can accomplish it. Indeed, if acquiring a self has something to do with adult responsibility, moral sophistication, or the ability to reason through the inherent conflicts in the human condition, then contemporary universities are falling over themselves to prevent students from acquiring one. The students at elite universities today are encouraged to prioritize music, athletics, and other forms of recreation over their academic duties. They may be disciplined by an administrative board with medieval standards of jurisprudence. Pressure to sign a kindness pledge suitable for kindergarten, this took place at Harvard. Publicly shamed for private emails that express controversial opinions, also took place at Harvard. And they may be muzzled by speech codes that would not pass the giggle test if challenged on First Amendment grounds. As the civil rights lawyer Harvey Silverglate put it, you can say things in Harvard Square that you can't say in Harvard Yard. In any case, the commonly expressed idea that a university education is a form of soulcraft is not as anodyne as it first seems. Nor is the recent insistence by administrators at my own university that students belonging to private single-sex clubs should be punished because these organizations are not consistent with Harvard's values. I find the promotion of soulcraft and the imposition of contested values on our students downright creepy, because they license moralistic propaganda and a condescending disregard for students' critical faculties. I say student souls are none of our business. A concern with soulcraft distracts us from a more coherent, defensible, and practicable understanding of the mission of the university, one in which free speech plays an inseparable part. Let me be specific. It seems to me that educated people should know something about the 13 billion year prehistory of our species and the basic laws governing the physical and living world, including our bodies and brains. They should grasp the timeline of human history from the dawn of agriculture to the present. They should be exposed to the diversity of human cultures and the major systems of belief and values with which people have made sense of their lives. They should know about the formative events in human history, including the blunders we can hope not to repeat. They should understand the principles behind democratic governance and the rule of law. They should know how to appreciate works of fiction as the sources of aesthetic pleasure and impetuses to reflect on the human condition. On top of this knowledge, a liberal education should make certain habits of rationality second nature. Educated people should be able to express complex ideas in clear writing and speech. They should appreciate that objective knowledge is a precious commodity and know how to distinguish vetted fact from superstition, rumor, and unexamined conventional wisdom. They should know how to reason logically and statistically, avoiding the fallacies and biases to which the untutored human mind is vulnerable. They should think causally rather than magically, and know what it takes to distinguish causation from correlation and coincidence. They should be acutely aware of human fallibility, most notably their own, and appreciate that people who disagree with them are not necessarily stupid or evil. Accordingly, they should appreciate the value of trying to change minds by persuasion rather than intimidation or demagoguery. I believe, and believe I can persuade you, that the more deeply a society cultivates this knowledge and mindset, the more it will flourish. And these desiderata for a university education, not terribly controversial, I would think, strike me as inseparable from a history and robust commitment to free speech. An implication of this kind of mission statement is that universities should not seek to protect students from discomfort, hurtfulness, or so-called microaggressions when they're exposed to beliefs that differ from theirs, or when the university does not accede to demands that it prosecute their moral and political crusades. The truth sometimes hurts, and discomfort is another word for tolerance. It's the price we pay for living in a democracy and participating in the open exchange of ideas. Now, it's true that free speech has limits. We carve out exceptions for example, fraud, libel, extortion, divulging military secrets, and incitement to imminent lawless action. But these exceptions must be strictly delineated and individually justified. They're not an excuse to treat speech as one fungible good among many. Despots in so-called democratic republics routinely jail their opponents on charges of treason, libel, and inciting lawlessness. Britain's lax libel laws have been used to silence critics of political figures, business oligarchs, Holocaust deniers, and medical quacks. Even Oliver Wendell Holmes' famous exception to free speech, falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater, is easily abused, not least by Holmes himself. He coined this meme in a 1919 Supreme Court case that upheld the conviction of a man who distributed leaflets encouraging men to resist the draft during World War I, a clear expression of opinion in a democracy. It's also true that the right to express opinions is not a right to express them in prestigious platforms. Newspapers and magazines are certainly under no obligation to publish every submission, and electronic media don't have to provide a nationwide megaphone to every orator on a soapbox. Nor is it an abrogation of free speech for a university to choose not to invite loudmouths and outraged entrepreneurs whose claim to our attention is provocation rather than scholarship and analysis. But exerting discretion in hiring professors or choosing speakers is not the same as punishing or silencing people who have met scholarly standards but are advancing unorthodox opinions. We know from recent events that this happens all too frequently on American campuses. In sum, I hope to have persuaded you that the protection of free speech is more than an item on a list of virtues, not just one good among many, to be lightly traded off against virtues like comfort, inclusion, and community. It is inherent to reasoned discourse and essential to the acquisition of knowledge, to the flourishing of humane democracy, and to the mission of higher education. And if you object to these arguments, if you want to expose a flaw in my logic or a lapse in my accuracy, it's the right of free speech that allows you to do so. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We're going to put you in the middle.
Thank you. Yes.
We'll put you in the middle chair. Well, it's a good thing that we've scheduled about 3 hours for this part of the program because you covered a little bit of ground there from cognition to religion to Mao to the Enlightenment. So let me start by asking you, as someone who's first a professional in higher education, what do you see happening if some of these current trends continue? What happens to the life of a university community itself? Because, as you noted, there are many people within universities, faculty, administrators, leaders, who are making the argument about restricting speakers and kinds of speech on university campuses. They don't think they are drastically changing for the worse the nature of higher education in universities. So what do you foresee happening? What are they missing about the likely trajectory if limits on speech continue?
One is that major ideas about policy, about society, may never see the light of day just because it is the people who would advance them are going to be shouted down, lose their careers, even physically assaulted. There's certain ideas that just right. Oops, am I sitting on a microphone? Am I cutting in and out? Yes.
Yeah, cutting in and out.
We may need another microphone. Put it higher up. Is that someone is making a gesture like that? So we may be systematically deluded. There may be ideas about anything from crime to gender relations to economics to inequality that just can't be said, so we'll never know whether they're right or wrong. But I think with the internet, it's going to be harder and harder to suppress ideas, even if they are not voiced within on a university campus. And I think there's another pernicious danger, which I didn't mention in this particular talk, but I've raised elsewhere, which is that people who do catch wind of heterodox ideas outside of academia will suddenly experience an epiphany. There are entire ideas that you can't say in polite company that might even be true. They feel as if they've been kind of empowered to a whole world of unorthodox ideas. And since in those forums they won't be challenged either, they can develop quite extreme, indeed toxic versions of them, unopposed by the usual give and take of debate. I think this is exactly what happened with the alt-right. The alt-right believe, in some cases correctly, that there are certain things that may even be true that you just can't say in polite company on a college campus, and for that matter, nowadays in a high-tech company campus. They feel that mainstream intellectual and media institutions can't handle the truth, and then they develop the most extreme forms of them. There's even a term for it, swallowing the red pill, becoming popular in the alt-right. So as a way of preventing the kind of concentration and exaggeration of beliefs in these other closed communities, or at least not so closed thanks to the internet, they have to be expressed and evaluated in arenas in which they can in turn be criticized, so that actually on both sides people can come to the most reasonable opinion on how things work.
Let me pose a follow-up to your remark about Harvard Yard and Harvard Square, that there's more freedom of speech in a public place outside the university than within universities. Well, among the speakers we've had in the series all year long are some who have said that that's a perfectly reasonable distinction. A university is not a public park, that principles of academic freedom, which include making judgments and discriminations about quality, should be the dominant principle, and that it's a mistake to be citing the legal principles about freedom of speech within a university community, because there are different kinds of communities. A democracy, law, public debate is a different sort of community from the university community. So what is your response?
Yeah, no, and I think that is an important distinction, but I think there's a difference between not making the guy in Harvard Square a professor or admitting him as a student or her on the one hand, and say punishing a student for saying something that is considered offensive or beyond the pale. So of course, being admitted to a university, getting grades, being hired by a university, being tenured by a university, all of these necessarily involve invidious discriminations. That is, some people get to do it, other people don't, and it can depend on certainly the quality of what they say. It shouldn't really depend on the content of what they say if it's justified by scholarly standards of evidence and argument. But all of that is the decision of who to privilege with allowing them to access to a restricted platform is different from punishing them once we have admitted them, once they are hired, based on the content of what they say. And I think that was the thrust of Harvey Silverglate's comment. Not that anyone at Harvard Square should become a Harvard professor, although one could argue that that would introduce some diversity, but that's certainly not what the point. The point is that that someone shouldn't be punished, which can and does happen.
Let me then pose a sort of a corollary of this argument, and it's related to your own discipline. We've had arguments that part of the distinctiveness of a university community or a campus is precisely the feeling by students and faculty and staff of being part of a community, of feeling safe and included. And if there isn't that sense, then there won't be higher levels of learning and exchange among certain members of the community. So that in some ways there's an emotional basis to the capacity for the higher kinds of rational discourse and learning that you're emphasizing. And it's on that basis that an argument to limit certain kinds of discourse on campuses, to make sure they are a safe community for all in the community, precisely for the reasons of higher inquiry. What do you think?
No, I think that I think that's nonsense. Yeah, personally. Now, I think it is true that there have to be standards of style of discourse, such as no Obviously, no violence, no intimidation, no insults, no name-calling, no shouting down, just rules of debate. But it can't be that the content of those beliefs are allowed to determine what makes you feel comfortable, because we know that true beliefs can make people uncomfortable. The idea of racial integration in the South was a challenge to the Southern way of life. And one could have made the argument that in Southern universities in the late 50s and early 60s, it would be challenging their sense of community if someone advocated racial integration, because it would have offended people, they would have no longer felt comfortable. And similar with gay rights, with women's rights, with the war in Vietnam. A lot of controversial ideas made certain factions on campus feel deeply uncomfortable and offended, but it's just too bad. I mean, that can't be the definition of being comfortable enough to learn and debate. Can't hinge on the content of beliefs, should only hinge on the way in which they are debated, where everyone is respected as a person. They're allowed to advance an opinion as long as they do so by the standards of logic and evidence.
I wanted to turn to a somewhat historical part of your remarks, your very opening about the First Amendment, but also later you mentioned the distinctiveness of the American commitment across multiple centuries now, that unlike some other liberal democracies, we have a deeper, firmer commitment to freedom of speech generally and on university campuses. So I wanted to suggest this possibility. It could be just a correlation, but there could be some causative link. Freedom of religion, including expression of the activity of religious belief, is also protected in the First Amendment. Mm-hmm. Might it be the case that we are distinctive in our commitment to a bedrock value, a bedrock principle of freedom of speech, because we think these are natural rights, going back to the Declaration of Independence, and as we discussed earlier today, the Declaration frames these as the laws of nature and nature's God. These aren't invented by human beings and therefore fungible, changeable. This is more fundamental than that. So perhaps our religiosity reinforces and supports our commitment to freedom of speech rather than being a hindrance or an enemy to it.
Well, this would be a historical argument that that's why...
Or even today. I mean, it was true in the 1780s and 1790s in the founding, but here we are in the 21st century and we still are distinctive in the degree of our commitment to freedom of speech.
Although there was freedom of religion. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I think I'm cutting it out. Okay. But of course, there was also a separation of church and state, which other Western countries don't have, and which have allowed them to have laws against blasphemy. I mean, that would be a case where the influence of religion, much greater, say, in a country like Ireland, traditionally, than a country like the United States, has allowed them to have laws that you could be thrown in jail if you take the Lord's name in vain, and something that we certainly don't have in the United States. So I'm not sure. I think freedom of religion and freedom of speech naturally go together. But I don't see how religious belief per se, or religiosity, would license free speech. The very concept of blasphemy is just incoherent outside the framework of religion. And as I tried to do this evening, I don't claim that any of the arguments are original to me, but that as many people have argued in defending free speech, it's just in the nature of discourse, the nature of rationality, that speech should be free. I don't think it flows naturally from any religious edict, although the freedom to embrace religious edicts, of course, would be very much continuous with the freedom of speech.
Good. Okay, well, I suspect there are quite a few questions out there in the audience. So you can see that we have microphones set up in the aisles. So what we'll ask you to do is come up to the microphones, and we ask you to abide by two principles about brief questions. First, that it be brief, and second, that it really be a question rather than a statement. So let's begin on this side. And just briefly identify yourself and then pose a brief question.
Hi, my name is Brent. I live in Tempe. I have a question about to what degree you would say that something like, particularly in media, I guess, but across the board in companies, profit and ratings have a negative effect on freedom of speech. And
Sorry, could you just say that what and what have on freedom of speech?
profit and ratings
Oh, profit and ratings.
have a negative effect on freedom of speech, and what you might do to combat that. And in particular, I guess maybe more like mundane examples, less like a dictator, but more, I guess, mundane examples of freedom of speech.
Now, are you referring to mass media, like television networks and newspapers?
Right. Or companies and media, advertising.
Yeah. Well, it's often, universities are nonprofits, and they're often some of the, well, at least in the notorious episodes, have been some of the most restrictive squelchers of speech. There's not so much profit, but it's often damage control or disaster preemption. That I think in many universities, the prime goal is to stay out of scandals, controversies, not the same as earning a profit, but perhaps not unrelated to the financial health of the university. And there has been a trend, as we all know, toward sometimes called the corporatization of the university. I'm not sure that that's I think that may explain why there hasn't been as much leadership as one might want from deans and provosts as presidents. But it's often the professors, and even more, I think, on university campuses. It's a layer of bureaucracy of associate deans for student life and counselors and housemasters, often forming their own professional guild, moving laterally from university to university, that have brought a culture of comfort at the expense of free speech to university campuses. So I wouldn't rule out the possibility that financial considerations militate against free speech, but I think it's also part of the culture of various professional guilds that have entrenched themselves in universities.
If I can ask a follow-up.
All right. My name is Jonah McCoy, and I would like to bring up the question regarding how you mentioned the issue of free speech becoming polarized within the political system. It's a notion that many of the other speakers in the series have brought up. So what I'm interested in hearing is how you think we can unentrench it, because you did correctly.
How we can
unentrench this from the political
yes,
system,
okay.
because as I think you astutely and correctly stated, that if we do not fix this and take it out of the political system and have it as a partisan issue, it will lead to the collapse of the republic and the democratic principles. So how do you think we can walk the dog back?
Yes, no, it's a really tough question. I offered one offhand suggestion in the talk, namely to be sure that there are controversial left-wing speakers in any parade of controversial speakers. But the rationale for free speech be articulated in politically neutral terms of just the requirements of learning and knowledge acquisition. It probably has to be part of a broader depoliticization of campus debate altogether, because the reason that we even face the danger of free speech becoming a right-wing issue is that campuses have moved farther to the left, and campuses have become less tolerant of free speech, and it tends to be the speakers identified with a political right that have been squelched or assaulted or shut down. So certainly university campuses, as John Haidt, who spoke in this series, has emphasized, should make moves toward a diversity of opinion so that universities themselves are not considered to be mouthpieces for leftist politics. That there should be a diversity among students, a diversity among faculty, and in the media as well, to the extent that we can, try to dissociate policy debates, policy recommendations, our understanding of recent history from particular ideologies on the right or left. So it's going to be, I think, a broader project than just how the free speech issue itself is branded, but that should be a component of it.
Thank you, sir.
Hi, I'm Craig. Do you support a reduction in funding for public institutions that don't tolerate free speech?
It seems like a rather coarse lever for exerting change, because the universities do so many things and have so many missions that that kind of behavior modification or punishment just might be too coarse, that I think it might be more effective to make the arguments, single out the particular abuses, take measures to prevent those abuses from happening, but an across-the-board reduction just seems to be too noisy a signal for universities to respond intelligently in response.
That doesn't seem to be working.
Well, no, but I guess one could treat the issue empirically and see if universities, I don't know if this has ever happened, that have been threatened with funding cuts if they don't liberalize their speech norms, actually move in that direction, or whether they become, or they just tolerate the cuts, use it as an excuse to get rid of things they don't want to have in the first place. So I don't know the answer, but that seems to me too coarse and draconian. But I might be wrong. Maybe we should look to see if it's ever been done and what the effects are.
Hello, my name is Edson. I wanted to know your opinion about Jordan Peterson. I mean, I think he's a very consistent person. The only thing I kind of disagree, I guess, is when he brings the religion to the talk, and I would like to know what you think about it.
Jordan Peterson.
Yes, right. Yeah, and I'm often asked about Jordan Peterson because we're both Canadian, we're both psychologists, we both taught at Harvard, we both are sympathetic to evolutionary psychology, we're both now and then in various ways politically not so correct. But actually our worldviews are pretty different, and his embrace of religion is one way, especially Christian symbolism and touchstones and themes. Another is his sympathy to the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, who I consider to be somewhere between a crackpot and a monster. His embrace of Jungian themes is something that doesn't really work for me. I'm much more of an advocate of Enlightenment values, of the possibility of improving society through, or improving the human condition through reason and science, and therefore have what I consider to be a more optimistic view about the potential of our species to improve its lot, to reduce suffering as opposed to valorizing it, which is an important theme in Jordan Peterson's worldview.
Thank you very much.
We'll explore these. We're going to have a dialogue at some point. Jordan has invited me to be on his interview series, and so we'll have a chance to explore our agreements and disagreements.
Social media plays a huge role in what everybody does. What recommendations would you have for the searches coming out of Google or the thought police that they're thinking about doing at Facebook? How does that intersect with what you're discussing?
Yeah, that's. I think that the social media companies are kind of fumbling toward a defensible policy that will, on the one hand, not compromise their role as platforms for free speech, but on the other hand, not lead to some of the political pathologies that we've seen, such as people whose own opinions just get reinforced by others with similar opinions, or the manipulation of communities of people with similar beliefs by external actors. It's such a complex phenomenon in which hundreds of millions of individual voices amplify or squelch each other in a platform that is so new that we don't really understand what those dynamics are, that I suspect there's going to be a lot of groping and fumbling for years to come to strike the appropriate balance.
Hi, I'm Shay, and I'm a senior at Seattle. By the virtue of having grown up in Iran, I have a fond appreciation for free speech. But my question is that when putting aside the United States' moral and global responsibility of being the beacon for freedom, just the argument for liberal democracy, a lot of people could mention that free speech is restricted in European liberal democracies. For example, hate speech, anti-Semitic comments, and their democracies, at least from the outside, seem to be working pretty well. What do you think of that?
Yeah, it is an interesting question. Like, what's so terrible about Denmark? Partly that we're starting to see in Europe the rise of a very well coordinated political backlash in the form of authoritarian populist parties. We also see that that the rest of the world, in large part, is kind of living off the United States as a source of ideas. One of the things that the United States does pretty well is its university system. There are students from all over the world who flock to American universities. There are American books that get translated. Ideas that originate from the United States are discussed elsewhere, I think more than in the other direction. I'll leave it at that. Those are two reasons to favor the American, I think, the American system.
Yes.
Yes. What, in your opinion, is the relationship between free speech and the funding of free speech, specifically in politics?
Free speech and funding free speech.
Yes, the relationship between free speech and the funding of free speech as it relates to politics. You made the quip at the beginning about the Orwellian ruling of Citizens United, and I was just curious to hear you elaborate on that.
So about campaigns and campaign finance, is that?
Correct, yes. So if free speech can't be limited, can the funding that promotes that free speech be appropriately limited?
Well, it's certainly not an easy issue in that across-the-board restrictions could be used to abuse, to squelch unpopular opinions. So it'd be a matter of some subtlety how to craft policies that regulate campaign contributions so that they don't become sledgehammers against unpopular ideas. On the other hand, certainly measures of transparency, that you can fund candidates, but everyone has to be able to know about them. Measures that would, without suppressing the content of any idea, impose some kind of reasonable safeguards on the extent to which they can monopolize public media. My understanding of free speech jurisprudence is that while the First Amendment prohibits regulation of speech based on content, there are many ways in which the manner of expression can be regulated. So, as I sometimes said, even though you have a right to a political opinion, that doesn't give you the right to have a sound truck go up and down the streets at 3 a.m. blaring out your political message, or to erect your soapbox in the middle of a 6-lane freeway. Those are appropriately regulated, and that kind of distinction could be, I'm guessing, coherently applied to cases in which it's just blatant that money is affecting the course of elections in ways that simply work in the interests of the people who have the money. I don't think it's an easy issue, but I think it's something that we have to grapple with.
Hello, my name is Maxime Quint. I'm currently minoring in the Skettle School. My question is, we talked a lot about speech codes tonight, but what attitudes and incentives have caused American universities to actually embrace these speech codes?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I don't know the answer, but I in part blame the fact that a particular kind of left-wing opinion has become so pervasive among the professoriate and the ancillary support systems of the university, the counselors, the freshman deans, the advisory apparatus, that there isn't the realization that there are reasonable opinions other than the ones that are held within this closed circle, that as the university has moved so decisively toward the left, as more conservative professors have aged and retired, and the uniformity becomes more rigidly delineated, then it just seems natural that opinions outside of that circle of acceptable ideas are outrageous, hurtful, not worthy of attention. That's one hypothesis. The other may be, and the one, and I alluded to this before, that it may be that with the transition of universities to provisioners of support, of guidance, of a simulation of a community within the campus, there's been an increasing power given to this layer of bureaucrats that regulates campus life at the expense of the exchange and discovery of new ideas. And so what I think should be the primary mission of a university, the creation and dissemination of knowledge, can be subsidiary to these vague community concerns. That might be a second contributor. But it'd probably take a good historian of the American university to trace out the events with more precision.
Thank you.
Yes. Hi, my name's Johnny Anomaly. I teach at the university down the road. We've corresponded.
Nice
so I wanted
to
to connect your conception of science with free speech and moral and political progress. And here's how I want to do it. So you mentioned Karl Popper and David Deutsch as saying science is something like a series of conjectures and refutations. We throw out a theory, we test it, the data comes back, and the world rejects it for us. And I think Kuhn has showed that's a little bit, Thomas Kuhn, a bit simplistic. So I bet you'll like this definition. Richard Feynman, who I'm sure you met some time ago, he said science is a way of trying not to fool ourselves.
Yeah.
And if we accept something like that as the core of what science is, at least the core, not a technical definition, wouldn't that suggest that the thing we want to do to promote real free speech is to teach undergraduates, especially freshmen, cognitive biases, have them read The Righteous Mind, for example, and thereby make them more open to understanding other people's views?
Yeah.
We can have them read Enlightenment Now, too, I suppose.
Yeah. Actually, I agree with two parts of your question. One is that when I, replicating Deutsch, I offered Popper's model of scientific logic as the paradigm for how science is done. I do agree that that's a simplification, and in fact, in Enlightenment Now, I note that a more reasonable picture of how science is actually done is that it's not the binary falsification of hypotheses, what's sometimes called the skeet shooting model of scientific progress, where a hypothesis is launched into the air like a clay pigeon and then shot to smithereens by the bullet of falsification. That probably isn't the way science works. It's very rare that you actually read an article in Science magazine that says we've failed to falsify a hypothesis. That probably a Bayesian approach, namely the logic of the Reverend Bayes as to how to adjust one's degree of credence in a hypothesis depending on its prior probability and the likelihood of the data that are observed, is changes the Popperian model from the just thumbs up, thumbs down to a more graded adjustment of degree of credence that we give, and that's probably more realistic. What it has in common with Popper's model is that it's data from the world that cause us to adjust our degree of belief in a hypothesis, even though it's not binary, but graded. The other part, and I absolutely agree that it should be part of the knowledge of every educated person that the human mind is subject to biases and fallacies, and that this should be part of woven into our educational system from the earliest years. The ways in which our intuitions about probability are systematically deviate from the way that the probability works. I tried to have that introduced as part of the general education curriculum at Harvard, and the suggestion pretty much fell dead-born from my lips. It was actually the mathematicians who killed it, not the humanities professors or the social sciences, because they wanted there to be just a quantitative requirement that could embrace linear algebra or analysis, and not just statistical decision-making, with its corollary of it being a curative for cognitive biases.
Good. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Pinker. My name is Frank. I am a student here, and I wanted to know what your favorite book is, or what book has impacted you the most.
What book has what? Has
impacted you the most?
Certainly, it would be hard to single out one, but I tend not to have kind of gurus or heroes, or I kind of take eclectically different things from different books. Certainly, The Beginning of Infinity by David Deutsch, which I alluded to, would be up there. I would say Richard Dawkins' two books, The Selfish Gene and The Blind Watchmaker, would be up there. There's some books that I read as an undergraduate. One by George Miller, called The Psychology of Communication. He's one of the founders of cognitive psychology, known to every psychology student as the guy behind the article, The Magical Number 7 ± 2. Some limits on our capacity to process information, and he was influential. I have, as a child, I was very much influenced by Isaac Asimov's book, 1, 2, 3, Infinity. It was just blowing my mind open to relativity and number theory and higher dimensions. And in the case of the development of violence and changes in violence over time, the books by a political scientist named John Mueller, called Retreat from Doomsday and the Remnants of War, describing the move away from war of the world over the last several hundred years, but especially over the last 65 years, was highly influential, and a lot of Mueller's books have struck me. I could probably come up with more, but no kind of single Bible that I just continually return to.
Thank you.
Okay, we've got time, I'm sorry, for just two more questions, so we'll take one from each side. Yes.
Hi, my name's Charlie Bullen. I became introduced to you a few years ago through the Long Now Foundation. But the question that I have actually...
Speak right into the microphone.
Yeah, we've got a pretty loud white noise source right behind our ears.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay, I'll go right to the question. You touched on it a little bit when you're talking about cognitive bias, but what I want to ask about is confirmational bias, which is a related topic. Do you feel that that's innate within humanity? And if it is the way that our media is currently arranged set up to actually make that even worse than it might automatically be? And how can one on an individual basis fight against that? And then what can be done on a societal basis to fight against that?
Yeah. I do think that confirmation bias is very deeply embedded in our cognition, maybe the kind of thing you might want to call it innate, and it is a major source of irrationality and folly in human life. And this has been shown in psychological experiments going back to the 50s, if not earlier. Well, certainly part of any well-designed debiasing or critical thinking curriculum would be to alert people to the fact that we're all subject to the confirmation bias. It should be such common knowledge that that it could be like a devastating gotcha if someone simply cites only the evidence that confirms their position and ignores the evidence that disconfirms it. How you can make a norm of rational inquiry second nature, something that I don't think we really know, but just as in, say, in most educated company, if you were to appeal to astrology to justify a decision, if you were to appeal to evil spirits as a explanation for why you came down with a cold or pneumonia, there'd be kind of a certain amount of snickering, and you just probably wouldn't do it because it would be just outside the realm of thinkable opinion, at least within many or most communities. How we can get the selective access to congenial beliefs to be as embarrassing as appealing to evil spirits. I don't know, but that may be our aspiration, to try to change the norms as to what counts as reasonable conclusions, discourse, modes of argumentation among educated people.
Thank you. And the final question better be good.
I hope so. My name is Thomas. Soon to be lost.
I have a higher authority asking to take one more question on this side. So, okay, go ahead. Yeah. You don't get the last question, but it can still be good.
I'm good?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
My name is Thomas. As a soon-to-be law student, I'm curious from the legal perspective, the issue of freedom of speech. And I'm curious, you mentioned Oliver Wendell Holmes earlier. Do you agree with his clear and present danger doctrine that he had written about in his Abrams dissent? Do you think it should go further? Is that the best way to approach freedom of speech from a legal perspective, or is there a better way to do that?
So, I'm sorry, what specifically are you referring, which of his opinions are you asking me about?
The clear and present danger doctrine as a way of measuring the limits of free speech. Is that an adequate way to approach free speech from a jurisprudence perspective, or is there a better way to do that? I'm just curious your thoughts on how much you do or don't agree with his perspective.
Clearly, something went very wrong with it if passing out leaflets against the draft during World War I was considered a jailable offense. So as stated, it doesn't work. Now, there may be circumstances in which one would want to, was it you said the Bill of Rights is not a suicide pact? Who said that? Some quote meister. Pardon me? Oh, Brandeis, thank you.
No.
However, I think it would have to be delineated in more detail so that it would not be abused as the fire in a crowded theater proviso was abused. So it would have to be, I think there'd have to be several more criteria for when it would count as a clear and present danger, so as not to be used as a kind of blunderbuss to suppress all forms of dissent. Because again, as I mentioned, every tin pot dictator cites clear and present danger as an excuse to jail their political opponents. So it has to be stated, I would think, explicitly enough to not allow that kind of abuse. And it would take someone who is more versed in legal theory and the formation of laws than me to make suggestions as to how that might be done.
Thank you.
Just want to note that assist from the audience came from Stephanie Lindquist, who's the Deputy Provost of the University, also a professor of law and of political science. So thanks. Oh, we're gonna check to see if it is Brandeis. Yes.
Sounds plausible.
Okay, so final question.
Hi, my name is Ana Reyes Sanchez. My question is, how, if at all, would you differentiate the right to freedom of speech with a right to the spreading of misinformation and inaccuracies?
Yeah, an excellent question. And it is, the problem, of course, is that we don't know what misinformation is unless there is some freedom of speech that allows opinions to be voiced so that they can be fact-checked. Again, this is probably a legal issue that I may not be well enough versed in the minutiae of jurisprudence to know how to safely adjudicate it. But for example, in the case of libel, if there's a person recklessly and knowingly disseminates a falsehood, that is considered legitimate grounds for punishment. And it may be that even though there may not be any simple one-sentence summary of how we differentiate the malicious or reckless dissemination of known falsehoods from the advancement of conjectures that people ought to have the right to voice, even if the majority thinks they're false, would be a difficult matter that might have to be worked out with attention to how it's been abused or not in the history of jurisprudence. So it's similar to the other questions, such as on campaign spending or on clear and present danger, that may be an issue where I would argue that we should draw the boundaries fairly tightly and exclude as few realms of speech as possible, but that there may be realms where we do have to carve out exceptions. Just they be carefully delineated with a very strong firewall.
Thank you.
Thank you. So do we have another lifeline?
Yes, just to be accused of falsification of the values that
Fact checking?
It is Robert H. Jackson, so I'm very sorry.
Robert H. Jackson.
Robert Jackson.
Okay, so it's not Oliver Wendell Holmes, it's not Louis Brandeis, it's not Yogi Berra, it's not Mark Twain.
Yeah.
Yes, right.
Well, I have a few closing remarks and thanks to give, but this is a closing of one chapter and helps us to open the next one. So some of the themes you mentioned about how suppressing speech can lead to further polarization and extreme forms of speech arising sets us up for next year's theme on polarization as a problem both in universities and in our political discourse, and then what remedies we might have. The general one we're posing is civil disagreement or civility, restoring that. So for all of the students who are here, we hope you will gather some information on the way out about our new major, our minor, the courses that we have on offer in the fall of 2018 and spring of 2019. I do want to say some thank yous to our partners, as I mentioned, the O'Connor College of Law and the Cronkite School of Communication, Journalism and Mass Communication, and as I mentioned, Arizona PBS. I do have to give specific thanks to the terrific team we have in the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership for events and communication, most especially Dr. Carol McNamara, who is our Associate Director for Public Programs, and then the whole team, Melissa and Gayla and Ty and Susan and Kim and our student workers, and if I left anybody out, I apologize. So we now have a reception for you outside. We hope to see you at the public affairs series we have next year on polarization and civility. And with that, please join me in giving one last thank you to Professor Stephen.